If Wuthering Waves don't make their latest combat event into a permanent endgame mode, I'll actually be upset. And I'm not even that into the game's combat. I enjoy it, but it's not my favorite part. After playing countless rounds of all the different types of endgame across several similar gacha games, I had kinda learned to overlook the parts which make each of them annoying and focus on the few things about each one which made them at least a little fun. Even when an endgame mode has serious problems, there can still be reasons to appreciate it. And despite there being so many different endgames already, WuWa's Virtual Crisis event, with a few minor tweaks, would be in a league of its own. To really dig deep into why I feel that way, let's talk about endgame in general, what it is, why it exists, and the pros and cons of existing ones in games I've played, so that we can see how this new event bucks the trend in so many ways. An endgame mode in a live service game is, in general terms, repeatable content which provides a challenge and gives meaningful rewards. The content is updated periodically with a fresh new challenge, and each update provides a new set of rewards. It's usually aimed at the more dedicated players, something to keep them engaged and interested once they've completed the rest of the important content in the game. A good endgame is especially important in gachas. Most gachas aim to capture the interest of a wider, more casual audience, but casual players could end up leaving if the combat seems too frustrating while they're still trying to get a feel for the game. As a result, the devs tend to keep the difficulty level pretty low for the most part. But that lower difficulty level would leave the most dedicated fans underwhelmed due to the lack of any challenge, which is where the endgame modes come in. If you look at it from the developer's perspective, what they want the most is to entice people into spending lots of money. One of the most effective ways to do that is to encourage dedicated players to make their favorite characters as powerful as possible via the gacha system, by pulling for weapons and for duplicates. If there is no difficult content to challenge, then there would be little reason for anyone to do that apart from wanting to collect characters, so a healthy endgame is a key driver for the game's revenue for a very important segment of the audience. And the design of endgame modes is one of the most effective ways for developers to guide their players towards the behaviors they hope for. Dedicated players will put in tons of time and effort to make sure that their account is powerful. For many, this ends up being what the game is all about. For better or for worse, endgame content provides the most influential scale by which we measure the strength of an account, and its design can fundamentally change exactly what these dedicated players spend all that time aiming towards. I'll talk about this a little more when looking at the two endgame modes in Genshin, since they're a perfect demonstration of this idea. From a player's perspective, the first thing that an endgame provides is a long-term goal to aim for, and a sense of purpose and progress which can motivate you to keep playing the game long after you've completed all of the one-time content like the quests or exploration. When you first attempt to beat an endgame mode in a new game, you usually end up getting thoroughly humbled. It takes time to build up the strength of your account, and since endgame is tailored to people who are at the end of their journey, when people earlier on give it a go, they do not stand a chance. While many feel discouraged by that first encounter, for those who keep trying, it can be a great way to measure their progress. As their account grows stronger, they get to see objective proof of their advancement as they're able to clear harder and harder levels. And then once they reach that final endgame, which provides a fresh challenge every month or so, by that point they're likely hooked on the endless treadmill of trying to beat or maintain your high score, achieve an even faster time, or even spice things up with some fun challenges or restrictions. Once you're hooked on the endgame, you're finally at a point in the game where things like the strength of your characters, your understanding of the game and how it works, your skill at combining the powers of the teams you've built, and your ability to use all of that understanding to combat anything the game throws at you all finally start to matter. Challenging content lends the combat in these games a very different purpose. It incentivizes skilled players to push further and rewards those who truly master the game. Players who don't bother with the endgame can still have a ton of fun playing around, of course, but it's just completely different context. It's like kicking around a football with your friends compared to playing in a competitive match. A really well-built endgame mode can even bridge that gap and convert people who were just in it for the fun into people who are excited to dive deep. This often gets overlooked by those who are already really into a given game, but it may be even more important from the perspective of the devs. Anything which converts casual players into dedicated ones is vital for the long-term success of the game. There's nothing wrong with just having a bit of fun, but for many, that extra edge brings greater satisfaction. A well-designed endgame mode can also provide variety and a space for creativity on the part of the players. Even if the game's core mechanics are solid, players will eventually get bored if they're doing the exact same thing every week or month without any variation. Most endgames provide some level of variety, with new enemy lineups, new mechanics, seasonal modifiers, and so on, which influence the strategies players need to use and spark discussion amongst the community. And if that variety is implemented well, it's a driving force which encourages player creativity. The best endgame modes reward diverse playstyles. When players feel like they can bring their favorite characters, not just the strongest ones, and still beat all the content, the game feels much more rewarding. And of course, a good endgame kinda has to have some form of incentives and rewards. Since these are gacha games, of course the main reward for completing most endgames is some gacha currency. While the amounts they give out tend to be really small in the grand scheme of things, barely even a single pull for completing any given level, over time they can add up and they're often a significant fraction of the currency available for free. For the developers, this is a balancing act. They want to give out enough rewards to motivate players to keep up with the content, but not so much that they take a significant hit to their revenue. For people who are maybe not quite the type who would really get into difficult game mode just for its own sake, these rewards are often the push they need to give it a try and keep at it in the long run, especially when they can get the majority of the rewards without pushing too hard. But the most important part? An endgame should be fun. This is a game mode for the most dedicated players, and if successful, they'll be playing it over and over again for a long time. If they don't enjoy the process, then in the long run, they'll just burn out and leave. Each player will have different tastes, so of course, it's impossible to create an endgame which is perfect for everyone, but if someone likes any particular game in general, it stands to reason that there's a good chance they would like an endgame mode which plays to its strengths. Games are supposed to be entertainment. Sadly, many endgame modes in gacha games seem to forget this. So where do existing endgames fall short? While I've played a few other games which have something like an endgame, let's focus on the three I've played the longest and enjoyed the most: Genshin, Star Rail, and Wuthering Waves. And before you sharpen your pitchforks and start a flame war, this is not going to be an argument for or against any of these games. Regardless of what you personally think about each of them, they all have interesting ideas we can appreciate, and they've all made mistakes we can hope they'll learn from. First, Genshin. I've played this game every day for almost 4 years now, and while I'll never hold back on deserved critique, I still enjoy it a ton, though more on that in a future video. While my account is fairly well invested, that investment is spread out across a ton of characters, so my builds are fairly average for a dedicated player. Despite being a little underpowered, I've completed both of the endgame modes to the maximum every refresh since maybe 6 or 7 months after I started the game. The Abyss is, of course, the original endgame, and I've always had mixed feelings about it. It's a perfect example of the most basic formula for an endgame: a simple fight against a bunch of enemies with inflated HP, with much of the challenge coming from a timer that you have to beat. It does a decent job as a measure of your progress early on, and I remember it being nice to see my account clear more and more as I caught up. It can be quite fun once you have a diverse and well-invested account. Even when you don't have the characters each Abyss is tailored for, figuring out unusual combinations of characters and elements to make the most of the enemy's weaknesses can feel like an interesting puzzle, which rewards a deeper understanding of the game. However, the format is very repetitive, with endless battles in the same flat circular arena, and no matter how fun the reaction system can make team building, the simplicity of these battles can highlight the game's lack of mechanical complexity a little too much. There are other annoyances as well, for example, having to repeat the earlier chambers if you need to adjust your team for the final one, or the way you can't just instantly retry if you miss out on 1 star by a couple of seconds. For a long time, I felt like the Abyss had a pretty decent balance overall. HP inflation was fairly modest, and character-specific mechanics like Fontaine's Numa Uja felt like a minor bonus where you weren't punished for skipping. But since the start of Natlan, the increase in HP inflation has been obvious, and the character-specific mechanics have become much more problematic, drastically reducing the scope for variety and creativity in which characters and teams can complete the content, which has sucked much of the fun out of the game mode for me. When before you could experiment with different teams, now it often feels like you're actively punished for not using the right characters. I've still had no trouble beating it, but that most important facet, that it should be fun, has been draining away. The Imaginarium theatre seems to be hated by the vast majority of people, but personally I enjoy it a lot. This comes back to that point I made earlier about endgame modes being a way for the developers to guide the players. For years, the Abyss was the only endgame in Genshin, and players understood that the correct way to build their accounts was to hyper-invest into a small number of characters, since that would result in a handful of teams strong enough to beat everything. However, that's bad for the health of the game. Some players get bored of playing the same characters all the time and end up quitting. Others stick with their favorites as long as possible and end up not spending on new ones. The obvious way for the devs to prevent that and encourage people to pull for new characters is for them to introduce power creep, which sucks for everyone. To me, the Imaginarium theatre felt like an attempt to solve that problem in a different way, by creating a new endgame which encourages people to spread their resources as wide as possible, so they can put together any random combination of characters and still have a usable team. The more characters you have built, the better, so pulling for the new ones is valuable and you can still use your old favorites too. As someone who basically built everyone to a usable level even before the theatre existed, I'd argue this game mode can be fun if your account is set up for it. I rarely have to use a team with bad synergy, and those rare occasions it can be an interesting challenge to win the fight anyway. It provides a different type of challenge and an outlet for creativity. However, I still think that this endgame is fatally flawed. First, it sucks for the vast majority of people who didn't stubbornly build everyone like I did. Second, it relies on RNG far too much. And third, the choices the player makes tend to either feel bad because they're compromising on the quality of the team, or inconsequential because the buff cards don't make all that big a difference. Those flaws make the game mode feel absolutely horrible to some players. While it's fun to play on my account, very few people will ever experience its potential, and overall I think that's bad design. It was a good direction for the overall health of the game, but they should have taken it more slowly and introduced incentives to spread out investment, which started small and got more pointed over time. And unfortunately, once you strip back all the extra trappings, once again the actual gameplay boils down to timed fight in a flat circle. I played Honkai Star Rail from day one, did not expect to enjoy it so much, but right from the start the combat had me hooked. However, over time I encountered two big problems. First, my absolutely disgusting luck. 5 times I pulled on the weapon banner, and every time I lost my 75-25 and went to pity twice to get a damn light cone. Being such a statistical anomaly really sucked away a lot of my good feelings towards the game. And second, I only pulled for characters I liked. And I didn't like Acheron, Linkshar, Rappa, and many more. So I skipped half of the top tier meta characters from the start of version 2 since I just did not want any of them. And most of the characters I did have were lacking their signature light cone since I was just done with the weapon banner. I ended up playing this game on hard mode. And because of all that, eventually the power creep in all 3 endgame modes became really obvious. It took longer and longer for me to clear with each refresh because I had to rely more and more on grinding for a perfect run with flawless RNG just to get by. I can be very stubborn. Sometimes it took me hours to clear, but I refused to give up. Until eventually I realized I no longer enjoyed the puzzle of trying to forcibly clear with unmeta teams. By that time, I no longer enjoyed the other parts of the game all that much either, so unfortunately I dropped it a little after the start of version 3. While Star Rail combat is turn-based, the endgame does have many of the same problems. The timers are just replaced with a limit to how many turns you're allowed to take. For example, each floor in the Memory of Chaos challenges you to complete 2 battles in less than 10 turns, and none of your characters are allowed to die. This endgame can be a good measure of progress to begin with, similar to Genshin's Abyss. Most of the variety comes from different enemies or from buffs which encourage certain types of characters or actions, but sadly most of the challenge just comes in the form of a DPS check, and there isn't much scope for variety and creativity. For a long while I was able to beat the content with my underpowered account by figuring out the perfect strategy, but the power creep and HP inflation just killed this game mode for me in the long run. Any level of mastery becomes irrelevant when you simply have no way to do enough damage, and that completely destroys the fun. Pure Fiction is more AoE focused. The enemies are weaker and more numerous, and there are more waves within each challenge. The goal is to wipe out each wave quickly with characters who can hit them all at once, and it favors follow-up attack teams where each action will trigger a cascade of attacks from your entire team. Variety, yet again, comes from rotating enemy lineups and changing buffs. The main difference is that the goal is to beat as many enemies as possible within a limited number of turns, with each wave providing more points than the last. Since there are fewer levels overall, this doesn't provide as much of a sense of progression, and while I enjoyed it at first, over time it suffered from the exact same issues as MOC. Apocalyptic Shadow started off as the ultimate boss endgame, in stark contrast to Pure Fiction. It heavily favored single target DPSs, though recent bosses have lots of minions, which have made this much more balanced. Similar to pure fiction, variety here comes from different enemies and different buffs, though this time there are no turn limits and instead you get more points for defeating the enemy faster. It's interesting how the mechanics of each of these game modes is structured so differently, but they all result in essentially the same style of gameplay. In all three, your goal is to kill the enemies as quickly as possible. Knowledge of the enemies and understanding of how to exploit their weaknesses goes a long way, but over time the HP inflation has led to all the endgame becoming less and less fun over time. When it comes to WuWa, I have a more complicated history. I started on day 1 and loved it at first, but enjoyed it less over time and dropped the game completely at some point in version 1.4. I gave it another chance when version 2 came out and found that with Rinasita, Kuro had fixed a lot of the issues I had with the game, especially some design decisions which had left me underwhelmed by the exploration in the earlier regions, which is very important to me as an exploration player first and foremost. I did make a video covering that at the time, but apparently, in my attempt at keeping it short, I didn't explain things in enough detail, so certain people were unable to understand where I was coming from. So far, I've only had the time to dive deeper into just one of the areas of confusion, but at least I got some good laughs out of the more unhinged comments. Sorry to disappoint the people who wanted me to stop playing the game, but yes, I am still here. I enjoy WuWa's mechanical complexity in combat, but so far I have not enjoyed the process of learning the unique timings and movement patterns of all the bosses, largely because they're slightly different for each character. It's the kind of thing which feels too much of a chore for me to practice deliberately, since any moment of satisfaction from the end of the process is vastly overshadowed for me by the memory of all the time spent not enjoying myself at all. However, WuWa's endgame has helped slowly turn the tide on that. The Tower of Adversity is quite similar to the Spiral Abyss in many ways, and I have similarly mixed feelings towards it. It has many of the same problems, a bland circular arena with simple fights against the timer, plus a frustrating experience when you're not quite strong enough to pass the DPS checks, but it does have some notable features which mitigate some of them. The Vigor system in particular is great. It adds a touch of strategy as you can pick and choose which battles to use your strongest characters against, and it removes a lot of the friction since you can challenge each individual chamber in isolation and freely stop and start at any point without throwing away your existing scores. It'll never be my favorite game mode, and I wouldn't describe it as all that fun, but the rewards are enough of an incentive that I still give it a go every refresh, and over time, the repeated challenges have slowly been improving my level of skill at the game. I've even been trying out the Hazard Tower as well and got 30 stars for the first time, a clear sign of progress, and naturally, as I get more comfortable with the more difficult combat in general, game modes like this start to become a little more satisfying. It's just a shame that the process isn't as fun as it could be. I'm sure some people love it, but for me, for now at least, it's merely okay. From what I've seen, many people enjoy the tactical holograms much more than the tower because they're much more of a pure test of skill and reactions. This is a great example of how subjective the fun aspect of this all can be. Many people enjoy hours spent grinding away at a hologram to build up muscle memory, which eventually allows them to flawlessly parry its attacks every time and even solo the boss with a single character. This brings to mind another comparison to sports. I cannot stand running just for the sake of running. Whenever I try, I become excruciatingly aware that I'm not enjoying any moment of the experience. But if I go play something like Laser Quest, I'll happily spend hours darting around the arena and only realize after it's over that I spent half a day running non-stop while crouching at the same time and my leg muscles no longer function. True story. For me, holograms are like running without any fun distractions. I just do not enjoy the process. I think what kills the holograms for me specifically is that when you fail, you don't just lose the battle, you lose all your energy. If you want to try again and your team needs their bursts up front, then getting them back is really annoying. If they refilled your bursts when you fail, then that might remove just enough of the friction for me to get into them. Until they make that change, I'll just have to admire other people's skill at beating them. Overall, they provide a much needed variety in endgame mechanics and a very high skill ceiling which really emphasizes the strengths of WuWa's combat, and I think it's great that they exist even if they're not for me. The Illusive realm is the only endgame out of all of these so far that I have happily spent time replaying just for fun. It's a roguelike mode with a touch of exploration which leans into the strengths of WuWa's combat system, sprinkles in some player choice and differentiated reward systems, and builds up to a finale where your character feels incredibly powerful even though you're fighting massively overpowered bosses. Personally, my only complaint is that it's not always available. For a long while, it was pretty much the only reason I was still playing the game, so I really noticed those times when it was absent for long stretches. Hopefully, they'll add it as a truly permanent endgame soon. However, as much as I enjoy it, it does fall short on some of the key things which make for a great endgame. This boils down to lack of difficulty. Since it's fairly easy, it doesn't provide that long-term sense of progress towards a challenging goal. It only mildly rewards optimization and true mastery of the game system, and the layer of strategy it enables via its buff systems is hampered by its reliance on RNG. I've appreciated the more recent trend in the Little Thousand Gateways game mode, which to me really is just a smaller Illusive realm, where many buffs give you greater strength at a cost of greater difficulty, but while I love this game mode, it rarely provides a challenge. Compare that to my steady progress in getting better at the tower. Since the Illusive realm is a little too easy, it doesn't push me towards improving at the game. It's great as a sort of intermediate endgame mode, but it would be even more satisfying if they were able to turn up the difficulty level a little without it impacting just how much fun it can be. And finally, Whimpering Waves. This game mode is much like the Tower of Adversity, but while it has some minor positives, I like it even less. Yet again, it's a battle in a static arena and the only difficulty is provided by a timer. But this time, it's against waves of enemies who have an infuriating habit of spreading out. It feels like it's just there to make the few characters who have some form of crowd control or AoE in their kit seem more useful, but the way it works is very unsatisfying. The token system is a good idea, however. You get to pick a buff for each battle, and since you can use each one a limited number of times, it introduces some trade-offs and strategy. They feel a little undercooked, but if they lean into this, then perhaps it could end up being like a mix of the tower and the Illusive realm, which sounds a lot more promising. For now, fighting wave after wave of undangerous enemies who just scatter away from you while you try to compete with the timer just feels uninspired. Thankfully, Kuro have acknowledged that WuWa has problems and they're working on it. WuWa regularly runs unique combat events exploring different ideas and challenges, and they clearly have an eye on adding them as extra permanent endgame. The Whimpering Waves endgame came from the pincer maneuver event, for example, and the latest one, called Virtual Crisis, has so much potential. It was legitimately fun, and it was easy to see how they could make it really challenging while encouraging much more variety and creativity than any of the other endgames. By far, the most important difference is that this game mode has no timers at all. I've spent years feeling disappointed that all the existing endgames are so reliant on timers to provide their difficulty, and yet it still surprised me just how fun the game can be when you have difficult combat which isn't a race against the clock. Instead, the difficulty comes from the huge variety of stress modules, selectable debuff cards which all stack up on top of each other since you can select dozens at once. This was fantastic. It's a great way for people to tailor the difficulty level to their own preferences, and as someone who isn't that into the more difficult parts of the game, I really enjoy challenging myself here. Without the timer getting in the way, the gameplay loop of trying different things, learning, and building up your level of skill was enjoyable, and I found myself continuing long past the point where I had claimed all the rewards. At first, I instinctively played the game mode just like any of these other endgames and tried to rush through the battle as quickly as possible. But it slowly dawned on me that I could do literally anything I wanted. It felt so freeing. Since there was no timer, I could build a team for survivability first and slowly chip away at the enemies. I could bring a team focused more on maneuverability and focus on staying untouched. I could play any non-meta character that I actually enjoy using and still defeat the content and collect the rewards. And even better, each challenge provided trial characters that you could choose to use. I'm always in favor of this. It makes the game mode more accessible in the short term for people who miss those characters, and it gives a true showcase for how the character would feel in your own account if you were to pull for them in the future. This is a far more compelling way to encourage people to pull than anything else, in my opinion. This structure puts so much more control back into the player's hands, and it makes for a great experience. The way they structured the rewards also promotes flexibility. Many are available for completing specific difficulty levels, but whenever you complete some of the content, you also gain a currency which you can spend in a time-limited shop, which provides some extra rewards. They introduced a quirk to this, which I've never seen mentioned with reference to endgame before: daily challenges which you could complete to earn some more of this currency. This is a fantastic way to make the rewards more accessible for casual players. It encourages them to repeat the content, which will naturally help them build up their skill level at a pace they're comfortable with, and is a great way to reward their dedication. I still think that in an ideal world, we'd have a single endgame shop which would provide a large portion of the gacha pool rewards per patch, and you could earn the shop's currency from any of the different endgames. That way, people could spend much of their time focusing on the parts of the gameplay that they enjoy the most. I would, however, love to see the difficulty taken even further. I completed everything with maximum difficulty level, so I'd imagine that for those who are really into WuWa, it probably felt a little too easy. Since the selectable buffs and debuffs give so much control to the players, I'd actually love it if they drastically raise the ceiling there so that people who want a real challenge can truly get one, especially if those higher scores are mostly for bragging rights. That level of challenge would add so much diversity to the game. It could legitimately be fun to bring an all-healer team to an overwhelming battle and challenge yourself to survive through the onslaught, for example. And it would be even cooler if they brought in some ideas from the Illusive realm, such as having sequential fights which unlock random buffs or debuffs depending on your performance. The Virtual Crisis event is, of course, far from perfect, but even this first attempt at flexible, customizable, challenging combat content feels like a big step up to me. It has the potential to tick all the boxes. It's challenging enough to provide a long-term goal and a sense of progress, and it does a great job of modeling that progress within a single round. It provides much more control to the players through its buff and debuff cards, and combined with the lack of timers, this opens up the game mode to a much wider variety of approaches and greater creativity. It even has some new ideas for incentives and rewards, which I feel are very positive. And most importantly, it's a hell of a lot of fun. As someone who still enjoys Genshin, I can only hope that Hoyo are taking notes. Their recent trend of ramping up the HP inflation is not good, and their lack of innovation when it comes to endgame content has been a weakness in that game for a long time. While WuWa's combat is probably a little better suited to truly challenging content like this, I'd still love to see something like Virtual Crisis make its way to Genshin 2. And as for Kuro, let's just hope they keep cooking. Until next time!